A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
It's a great opportunity today to talk about faith and trust for ministry organisations like churches, like schools. What about hospitals and all sorts of charities that you may be a part of or that you make donations to? Integrity is an issue and the expectations are high around standards of governance, transparency and accountability. Well, our special guest today is leading an initiative delivering high-level accreditation that demonstrates that the Christian organisation has been carefully assessed against the principles of ministry accountability. And to get that accreditation, those organisations need to score a full 100% passing grade. Well, we're talking to CMA today, Christian Ministry Advancement, and Steve Kerr is Executive Director of the CMA Standards Council. He's usually based in Melbourne, but there's a conference on, starts tomorrow. He's sitting with me in the studio. Steve, a special welcome along to 2020.
Yeah, good morning, Neil. Thanks very much for having me here.
Steve, let's start this with something of a scenario. It's one thing, isn't it, to give a $100 donation to your favourite charity. It's another thing if you have more substantial means and you're able to give a bigger donation, like, so let's just say $100,000. And if you're giving that bigger donation, you might really want to know that the organisation that you're giving to is the real deal and they have some high levels of accountability. Is this a way of talking about the sort of thing that you do?
That's a good way of putting it, Neil, although it applies not only to big donations but small donations as well. And donations can be in more than just money as well. There are a lot of people who volunteer their time for Christian organisations or volunteer their talents, their networks. And so all of those are resources which have to go to any Christian organisation.
So any organisation we're talking about here, whether they're dealing in the $100 donations or the $100,000 donations, every Christian organisation has some levels of accountability, not first of all because there's a set of principles you might identify, but because there is some accountability to God. So governance is an issue here.
Absolutely right. Of course, everyone knows that one day we're going to have to give an accounting to God. And Jesus was quite clear about that in the parables, particularly the parable of the talents, one of my favourites. But we also have accountability, or should have accountability, here on earth. Because if you're not accountable to someone, then you have absolute power. And we know the old saying about absolute power. It corrupts absolutely.
You know, let's just settle on a thought or two here about corruption, because typically, without accountability, corruption seems to be something that starts to snowball. And, you know, there are those who might even recognise there are corruption indexes and all sorts of things. There are people that monitor these sorts of things. And nations, even including Australia, are becoming more corrupt. Now, we've had a whole lot of trust in past times, but there is something that does move us towards corruption if we don't have levels of accountability.
Yeah, it's called sin, I think, Neil.
Okay, good.
And sin is ever present. The enemy is always watching. He wants to put obstacles in the way of God's plans. And he does that because he works in our hearts. And every human heart, as I think Alexander Solzhenitsyn said, it's got a line down the middle. And you've got good on one side and sin on the other side. And often sin wins. So one of the things that we want to do at the CMA Standards Council is try to put guidelines in place. It's a bit like swimming between the flags on the beach. You've got your flags at one end and your flags at the other end, and you want to stay inside those flags. And so we try to put our standards in place to hold people within the flags.
And if you happen to get caught in a rip while you're swimming between the flags, there's someone there to dive in and help to rescue. Is that part of the illustration here?
Wow, we're taking the analogy a long way here, but yes, that is right, because when we set our standards, we do that as a snapshot in time. So, like, as at this particular date, yes, the organisation is meeting all of the standards. But we know that that's not enough. So we renew the standards every year to make sure that people are still following all of those standards. And we find that is a great benefit for organisations because it means that they embed these standards of good behaviour, of transparency, of good governance and accountability into the very DNA of the organisation, because each year they have to check, are we still staying with our charitable purpose? Are we still following our statement of faith? Are we still following all these good policies and procedures to make sure that we do things the right way?
And Steve, I guess almost all, I don't want to give a blanket 100%, but almost all Christian organisations start off with best intentions. They do want transparency, and they've got some biblical principles at the heart of what they do. And things begin to grow, a level of trust begins to increase, and the budget is much bigger, and people are giving bigger donations. But as the organisation continues to grow, and there's transitions of leadership, and when there are changes that happen, sometimes you've got to find something that's external to the organisation that actually keeps the way of understanding and accountability and understanding those principles in place. How do you talk about the fact that organisations are growing, changing, and that there's always some sort of new leadership coming in, and they've got to come back to some principles as well?
That's absolutely right, Neil. Indeed, one of the biggest challenges we see for, in particular, small Christian organisations that are starting up is that almost inevitably the person who starts the ministry is a charismatic person who is really committed to the particular objective that they want to pursue, the part of the gospel, the part of God's kingdom that they want to build. And they're really strong on that. They want to spend all their life doing it. Well, the reality is we only have so much bandwidth inside our brains and our hearts. And if you've got 90% of your bandwidth on doing this great job, the 10% that's left isn't enough to do all the things that you need to put around it to make sure that the organisation keeps going. I like to use the analogy of taking a car trip, doing a road trip. You've got the driver, and it's the driver's job to get from point A to point B, and the driver can do that a great job. He'll navigate around the potholes, or she'll know that there's going to be a storm coming and you have to go a different route or whatever. But there's more to doing a road trip than just the actual driving. You've got to make sure you've got the right car. You've got to have a map. You've got to know where you're actually going. You need to have paid insurance. You need to have enough money to buy the petrol on the way through. There's a whole lot of admin and stuff that needs to be put in place for the car trip to work. And it's the same with a Christian organisation, particularly as you get more and more people involved. You have great gifts coming in. That's why you have more people. It's the body of Christ. You have different gifts to do different jobs. But unless someone organises all of that and makes sure that everything is in place for it to happen, then it's going to fall off the rails.
And, we have in our thinking, don't we, our local church, and your church might be part of a denomination. Some people say, why does that have to happen? Why can't you just be autonomous? Well, part of what you're saying here, Steve, comes into how all of that 10% gets looked after in a more determined and more efficient way. But you've got churches, charities, you've got schools, hospitals. I suspect that even listeners now just don't know just how big the Christian sector is in Australia. And it is huge when you start to talk about the schools and the hospitals, where 40% of all schools are actually those Christian independent schools. There's a lot of them. There's a lot of Christian organisations.
You're dead right about that, Neil. My background was not in ministry. I was a corporate lawyer. And that's a long story, Neil. I won't bore your listeners with it now, but I saw the light and got out of that about 10 years ago and decided I wanted to be more involved in building the kingdom. But my knowledge of the Christian sector was pretty much my church, a bit more broadly my denomination. I'd been on the boards of a few Christian organisations, but until I got involved in it full time, I had no idea of the scope, the variety, and wow, it's amazing. I am in awe of many of the organisations that I interrelate with and people I meet who've given their lives to serving God in the particular calling that they have. But it's massive. It's a massive number of people.
And let's assume that because the Christian sector in all of those different areas is so massive, there's going to be a bad apple or two along the way, and that gets big publicity. But when we talk about this issue of trust, I mean, trust is a whole big issue on its own, isn't it? Because trust from the people, because of your accountability, because of your trustworthiness, because of your integrity, that's the thing that breeds success of expansion. And when people trust what you're doing, they're going to be able to support it in a much more substantial way.
Absolutely. People don't give their resources to other people unless they trust them. Now, in your local church, you might have 70, 100, 200 people in your congregation. You will know the ministry staff, and you will trust them, and you'll be inclined to give your normal offerings to help support the work of the church. But once you get out of the people you actually know firsthand, what you're working on is the reputation of the organisation or endorsements from other parties. And how do you really know what whether that reputation is warranted, and whether the endorsements you're getting from your friends or reading in the newspaper or hearing on Vision Christian Media, how do you really know that you're getting the real deal, that you really can trust these people to use your resources as you want them to be used?
Is this where that word governance comes to the fore? Because the way we trust an organisation is often based on how they are governed. How do you describe that?
Well, the old saying is that a fish rots from the head. And part of what I learned in my corporate law background is that inevitably when things go wrong, you can trace it back to a failure in governance in some way. Now, whether that's not putting the structures in place, whether it's choosing the wrong people to lead the organisation, whether it's not reporting back to the stakeholders of the organisation in some way to keep them part of the organisation, any of those things can go wrong. And when they go wrong, Neil, it's spectacularly wrong. And it is so sad, because God gets judged by the way that we act. And the watching world sees the way we act and thinks we can't trust God because look what his organisations are doing. And that makes me weep when I see things like that. That's what gets me out of bed to do this job.
This new accreditation is a relatively new initiative, and it's being taken up by organisations. Can you rattle off a few names for us of organisations that are a part of this new accreditation with Christian Ministry Advancement?
Yes, we have a very broad range of organisations because we believe that governance is pretty much the same no matter how big or how small the organisation is. So we would range from very large organisations like some schools. St Philip's Christian Community School is one of our bigger organisations. Scripture Union Australia, Compassion, all very large organisations. Tier Fund, but we have quite small organisations as well. We have local churches, some big, some small. We have lots of organisations that do aid and development overseas, lots involved in chaplaincy, media, of course. In fact, one of our most recent accredited partners is Vision Christian Media, You've probably heard of them, Neil.
Thank you for mentioning that. And I know that our team at executive level and our board have been very mindful that as a growing organisation, Vision needs to absolutely be right at the centre of that sort of corporate governance model which reflects integrity, so that people who are giving a larger gift, a larger donation, or even the smaller donation, can be recognising the trust factor there, because as a bigger and more successful, you might even say, growth around Australia, people need to have that level of trust in the organisation like Vision.
That's absolutely right. Yes, and passing our test, meeting our standards, being fully accredited, means that stakeholders like donors or volunteers or board members or potential board members can have confidence that Vision is committed to doing the very best that they can do for God. And it's not only that, Neil. It's not only that. It's that the watching world can see that we Christian organisations hold ourselves to a higher standard than we have to do. We go the second mile because we hold ourselves to those higher standards, and the world can see, the world will see that we do that. And Peter says in his first letter, the Gentiles will see the honourable way that we act, and they will honour God as a result of that. So our actions, the standards we hold ourselves to publicly, actually act as an advertisement for God. And what we're trying to do is rebuild God's reputation after the bad rap that God's been getting over the last few years.
Life, culture and current events from a biblical perspective. This is 2020 with Neil Johnson on Vision Christian Radio.
And we are talking about the sort of standards that we might think are in place for the Christian organisations that we are a part of and those that we are making donations to. Well, our special guest this hour is Steve Kerr. He's Executive Director of the CMA Standards Council, usually based in Melbourne, but he's here with me in the studio, and our talkback line is open on 1800 316 316. You can also send us a text on 0447 488 316. Steve, let's talk about these standards. If we're talking trust and faith, we're talking integrity, we're talking about Christian organisations that need to have a higher standard than anybody's anticipating. Let's talk about those standards. What are they? Where do they come from?
Oh, Neil, when we started this up, we based ourselves off some similar organisations in other parts of the world. There's an organisation in the United States and another one in Canada. Both have been going since the early 1980s, doing this sort of work. And we decided this is something that we need in Australia. And so we wanted to start it up and offer that. So the first thing that we needed to do was actually decide what are the standards that we want to hold Christian organisations to. And the way that we did that was quite broad. We looked at pieces of legislation like the Corporations Act or the Associations Incorporation Act. We looked at regulatory requirements from our friends at the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission. We looked at academic texts. We looked at similar secular organisations like the ASX or the Australian Institute of Company Directors. And one of my colleagues actually got a whole lot of books on governance, Christian governance from around the world, and he sat down and he wrote down the chapter titles for every book and put them up on a board and mapped them there to see what are the main ones that everyone talks about. But most of all, Neil, we based it on the Bible. And we looked at what are the biblical foundations of Christian behaviour. How does the Bible talk about governance? Now, a lot of ink and blood has been spilled in the past over governance, and lots of Christian denominations have separated because of governance. But there are some principles which are very clear in the Bible.
Let's talk about some of those, and maybe just in a nutshell, because I'm sure there's a lot of principles. Sometimes the most important thing to know is that there are a lot of important things to know. But let's talk about a few of these principles. What comes to mind for you if we're talking about these biblically founded principles that should actually shape the governance of the Christian organisation we're part of, or that we're thinking of giving some money to?
Our first principle, and the most important principle, the one that distinguishes us from every other organisation in the world, is God first. And so we say that the organisation has to declare its Christian ethos and confirm that it acts in accordance with that ethos. We want to see God being a central part of the governance of the organisation.
There's a whole list. I've even got a little bit of insight into those here in front of me as making some preparation for our conversation today. The organisation's got to be registered, legitimate, and an active Christian charity. So there's a certain status that an organisation needs to hold. It's not just put a shingle on the door and tell people that you are a godly person or a good godly organisation, but there's something in that status.
Yeah, one of the things that is talked about in the Bible is that you have to follow the secular laws. And Paul was quite specific about that in Romans, saying that you need to follow the way that the laws are set out. And that's so that people will see what we do and not be able to attack us through not meeting the laws of the country. The only way that they'll be able to attack us, if they really want to attack us, is because of our dependence on God. And that's what Daniel did when he was the reason he was thrown in the lion's den was because the Persian emperor had made some rules that he had to follow, and he wouldn't follow the ones that were against God, but he followed every other rule that was there.
So following the rules, understanding what the rules are that are civil rules, but recognising that there are even higher rules than that, and they're the rules we follow when we follow God. Hey, taking calls 1800 316 316. Let's hear from Brenda in Bundaberg in Queensland. Hey, Brenda, welcome.
Thank you. Good morning to you.
Brenda, what are your thoughts for our conversation?
I'm actually really excited. What you're talking about is something that I personally have a background with, more in civil construction. But like you, Steve, I came to a realisation I actually had a severe personal situation where I was unable to continue work. Basically, God got me and showed me just what a waste my life was without him. And now I'm in this situation, I have been for a number of years, where I just keep asking, Lord, what do you want me to do? I have a non-believing husband, and who is a wonderful, wonderful guy. But I have been very aware for a number of years that my job is with him at the moment, of being a witness to him without being pushy in any way. And I have just been so frustrated for so many years because I have this incredible work history and things that is just sitting here gone to waste.
Brenda,
and I haven't known what to do with it.
You are in a situation where, a time will come when you'll be looking for extending yourself into some areas where you'll know that God has called you and he's gifted you for those things. A quick thought here from our guest Steve for Brenda, who's obviously really connecting because, there's a certain sense in which your story is that you decided there's something you need to do that's going to be effective with an eternal purpose. Here's Brenda, who's just making a response here. Any thoughts?
Brenda, what you're saying just resonates with me because it's not dissimilar to my own situation. I said to Neil I wouldn't bore the listeners with my own story, but I was a reasonably successful corporate lawyer, but I wanted to get more involved in the kingdom. And I used to think, what can I do? What skills have I got that God's going to be able to use in his kingdom? Now, my wife, who's a wonderful person, she volunteers at our church, and she puts together the kids' play packs for the back of the church during holidays, and she does the laminating and fixes the PowerPoint presentation for people at the church. And she's got a skill set that every church would die for to do all those jobs. For me, well, if World Vision wanted to make a takeover offer for Compassion, I'm your man. But that doesn't happen very often, Brenda. So I was just sitting I used to pray in the shower every day. God, what can I do? What can you put in front of me that I can help? And I did that for years, literally years. And then due to a series of events which could only have been inspired by God, I read an email one day and saw that this job was starting up for the CMA Standards Council, and I had 2 minutes to spare, so I clicked on what's the position description, and I went through the list of requirements, and there were 9 requirements there, and I ticked 8 of them, and the 9th one was have IT skills, and I thought, well, nobody's perfect, Neil. But Brenda, let me assure you, God has a plan for you. Let me just assure you that is the case, and there's a dry season sometimes before you find out what it is, but God's timing is perfect.
Hey, let's start this part of our conversation, Steve. Let's put ourselves here in the shoes of someone who's making a donation. We've been talking about, governance and what happens at that level of an organisation and the necessary trustworthiness. But if I'm a person who has a few spare dollars to give as a donation, a lot of people are giving this time of year, how do we empathise with a person who is thinking about making a donation and what's going through their mind as they're about to give that gift?
Yeah, it's a very good question, Neil. I actually attended a 2-day seminar given by a professional fundraising organisation, which is originally based in the States, is now here in Australia. And they went through with the group who were there the psychology of people making donations. And I was really struck by that because there's a whole process, psychological process, that we all go through when we make a donation, probably whether we know we're in the process or not. And there is a point where you get right to that second just before you press the button on your mouse to click to make the donation on the online or through your bank account or whatever. And at that point, the research shows that people have almost donor's regret, if I can put it that way. Yep. And they think, wow, I'm about to actually do this. Do I really know that this organisation can be trusted with my money? And at that moment, one of the things that tips people over the line is a third-party endorsement of the organisation. So they can see, it's not just me who thinks this is a good organisation. There's somebody who I can trust who looks at all these organisations, and I can see that they say they're all right. So, okay, I can do the transaction, and they click the button.
Is there a sense in which, for a lot of people, that third party might be a friend recommended that I make this donation now, but the friends might be just as much in the dark as you are, but because you're responding, you're making a donation. And I know listeners who make a donation to this organisation, Vision Christian Media, and of course our Visionathon appeal, you could say is still happening right now. But, my friend said it's a trustworthy organisation, therefore I should give. Taking that to a new level is that third party that actually isn't necessarily a friend, but actually has some standards by which they could actually wield a stick. And I know you're not actually into wielding sticks and things like that. You're into setting the standard, but you want to have that third party that's separated that can actually prove to you that those standards are being met.
Look, your best mate from the footy club or the girl that you have coffee with that you meet once a week after you're doing your shopping might be a great friend, but they don't necessarily understand about governance or about the organisation. So having a third party whose job it is to check those things and check them in depth is really the ultimate accreditation. And Neil, I have to say, we ask a lot of questions of our partners. We call them our accredited partners. And some of it's publicly available information that we check, but a lot of it is information that the organisation does not have to disclose to anyone. And so they do that in humility, and just that humility itself is the mark of a good Christian organisation. And they will tell you pretty much, they tell me a lot of stuff that most people do not know. And I'm able to get in there and really lift up the bonnet and see what's going on in the governance of that organisation.
My suspicion is that's a very uncomfortable process. When somebody gets to the point where they say, well, I might just check out these CMA people and get a bit of more detail about this. And what if I take the next step and actually make a formal inquiry, and how am I going to be part of this? I know you've got a process that you put people through. And then they get to talk to you, a former corporate lawyer, and someone who's going to ask really, really drill down deep questions. I don't know whether you can let us in on any of those sorts of questions. What would be uncomfortable for an organisation to share? Is that appropriate? I don't know. Well, I mean, you want to keep that maybe you're under your hat, but these are the sorts of things that you have to know if you're going to accredit an organisation.
Yeah, look, I think, Neil, you said earlier in our conversation that 99.99% of Christian organisations are great organisations, and they love the Lord and they really want to do the right thing. And I've found that in 99.9% of the people that I go along and accredit. They love the Lord and they really want to do the right thing. But they don't always know what the right thing is. You don't know what you don't know. And because of that, we often help organisations because we say, for example, do you have a written policy on how you recruit new board members? And they will say, oh, well, look, we sort of know how to do that. And I say, well, have you got it written down? And they say, oh, no. I say, well, I can tell you as a lawyer, if it ain't written down, it doesn't exist. Because it might be in your head, but how do you know it's in the head of the next person to take over your role at the organisation?
In some sense, there ought to be floodgates open of those organisations that name the name of Christ to actually get this formal accreditation. As you say, there's that 0.1%, the 99.9 are all good, and there's some who are outside that. There ought to be floodgates open. Everyone should be rushing to your door to make sure they've got this accreditation. And if you don't rush to your door, then you might be asking the question, what is it I've got to hide?
Oh, you're dead right about that, Neil. And we have had people come along and say to us, why is this organisation I'm giving money to not accredited? And all I can say is they may be a great organisation and God may be moving in them. They don't think it's important enough in the context of all the other things that they're doing to spend the time and effort on getting accredited. And there is some time and effort. And there's a reasonable fee for doing it, but it's not outrageous. It's well within the bounds of the organisation's resources, because it depends on what those resources are, how much we charge a fee for. But I find one of the reasons, Neil, that people don't necessarily come to get accredited is complacency. I often talk to friends or colleagues or people I come across, and they say, what do you do, Steve? And I tell them I accredit Christian organisations against good standards of governance and transparency and accountability. And they say, that's fantastic. That is so needed for our Christian organisations. There are so many Christian organisations which are just not really well run. But my organisation's fine. There's lots of others, though, that could really use your help. And it's a bit of a sad reflection that people think I'm okay. And that's often because there's a bit of an echo chamber in their board. They all think they're doing a good job, but unless somebody comes in from the outside to show them, you know what, there's actually a better way. Or, you know what, you haven't thought of this aspect. Or, do you know what, you're doing really well here. And you should be proud of that, and you should be telling other people how you do that. But without somebody coming from the outside, you just don't get that.
You know, what I notice is there's a lot of Christian organisations that rely on the donations of their supporters to meet their annual budgets. And Vision is one of those, and we were talking about that too. But it's not just about money, it's not just about donations, is it? Because I know that there are a bunch of people who have this accreditation with you who don't even raise funds, but they are concerned about their own image of integrity.
That's absolutely right, Neil. It's not all about money. It's obviously people want to raise resources to do what they do, but probably 20% or so of our accredited partners don't ask for funds from the general public. The reason that they want to become accredited is because they know they need to be trusted for the work that they do. And they may be out there providing services to Christian organisations or to Christian people and perhaps charge a fee for their service so that they don't need to raise funds. But they still need to be trusted in order to carry out their mission.
Let's come back to, pardon me, some of the principles we were talking about a little earlier. For listeners who are thinking about the value of this sort of accreditation and what sort of things ought to be at the heart of the organisation that you're a part of. And we mentioned a couple of those. One of those was, you put God first. And that sounds like, that's a taken, that's a given, isn't it? That's the simplest one, although that's not necessarily all that easy to do too once you start getting into what does that mean to put God first. We mentioned that there needs to be a legitimate and active recognition of that charitable status. Let's talk for a moment here about diligent governance, because this really happens at the top of organisations, but this is one of those things that you like to drill down deep on and make sure that those sorts of diligence governance principles are in place for organisations.
Yes, that's right. And diligent governance looks like having a properly structured body that governs the organisation, that acts with care and diligence and independence.
But hey, Steve, we downloaded that constitution off the internet and we all signed off on it. Doesn't that account for everything?
Oh, if only it were that easy, Neil. If only it were that easy. Just having a written constitution is, how can I put it? It's like having a skeleton without any flesh, without having any muscles, without having any brain attached to it. For any organisation to succeed, you need to have processes and procedures. Once you get beyond one or two people working in an organisation, you need to have processes to make sure that everybody acts and goes in the same direction and follows the same rules to achieve the same end. And without those processes and procedures being in place, the organisation will eventually just fall apart. And it's sad to say, but there are lots of high-profile and low-profile examples of that sort of thing happening in Christian organisations.
Another one of your standards comes around responsible leadership. And I mentioned a little earlier, sometimes you've got transitions to new leaders, and the longer an organisation is in existence, the more transitions there are. And some people look good on paper, but might not necessarily hold the sort of ethos and values that we might think are highly especially desired as Christian believers. What do we think about responsible leadership?
Responsible leadership and leadership succession are probably the most critical parts of any organisation, because it's the leader that sets the tone, sets the culture of the organisation. And so the board's job of choosing that leader and supporting that leader through their job is absolutely critical. And go back a step, choosing the right people to be on the board to make the decision about who the leader is even more fundamental. And so getting the right chairperson, getting the right treasurer, getting the right board members, having all the skill set that you need, but above all, having people who love God is really not an easy thing to do.
And setting a accreditation in place sets up safeguards for an organisation. As you say, those things are reviewed every year, and so there's this fresh implementation that has to happen at board level and then in your leadership of your organisation. They're always mindful that there are certain standards that need to be met to maintain that accreditation, but also to maintain that trust and that integrity with all of the people who are supporting. Hey, let's go a bit more broad on CMA. And CMA, a conference on in Brisbane, next couple of days, starts tomorrow over a couple of days. You do all sorts of good stuff. One of those things, just to highlight here, you actually have a board internship program. So CMA is interested in having the sort of integrity that we're talking about installed in leaderships of organisations everywhere.
Oh, yes, Neil, I'm glad you asked that question. One of the things that we have found when we're talking to our partners, our accredited partners, and more broadly in the Christian sector, we talk to boards, we talk to chairs, and two of the things that we hear quite a lot are, first of all, we don't have any young people on our board. We don't know how to connect with the next generation, and we need our organisation to connect with the next generation. And the other thing we hear is, who's going to take over our organisation when we step off the board? Who's going to govern it into the future? Yet, on the other hand, we talk to young people, Neil, and they say, you know what? I think I've got something to offer in being involved in governance or being on a board or a committee at some stage in the future, but I don't have any skills. I don't have any training, I don't have any knowledge, and I don't even have a network for somebody to ask me to be on a board. So we had what you would think is not necessarily the genius idea of putting those two things together. And we call it the board internship. So we take young people between the ages of 22 and 35 who have an interest in governance, and we place them as interns on a well-functioning Christian board for a year. We assign a mentor for them from the board. We give them a whole lot of training, coming to CMA conferences, doing webinars with really high-profile people and experts in their field, and leave them in a position where if they graduate at the end of the year, they're trained and equipped and ready to go. And our vision is that in a few years' time, we'll have hundreds of young people who are ready to serve for the next 30, 40 years of their life on Christian boards to make sure that they meet these standards, continue to meet these standards that we're setting at the CMA Standards Council.
So it's not just short-term fixes. There's a medium term, there's a long term here. It's about getting those young people equipped to be able to be effective in a ministry role in those board settings. A text from a listener. Greg says, a message for your caller questioning God's plan for them. You feel God has sent you into exile, a place where you don't want to be. I've found this scripture a great message of encouragement, Jeremiah 29:7, but seek the welfare of the city where I've sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. That's a reflection back on a listener who called about a half an hour ago. But this idea of getting prepared to do something effective with an eternal purpose, in some sense, that's around that type of message, isn't it?
Absolutely. And Jeremiah also talks about God having plans for every person, good plans for every person. And we like to hope that some of those plans will be realised through the structures that we put in place with accreditation and with preparing people for the future so that they can realise God's plans for them.
Let me ask you, only a few moments left for our conversation, for listeners today who are a part of a leadership of their organisation, and we talked about churches and schools and hospitals, any charity that says I'm a Christian charity. What's the process for actually getting this level of accreditation we're talking about today? Because ultimately this is going to be a very significant accreditation.
Yeah, well, first thing, you just get on our website, Neil, and you'll see there that there's a expressions of interest form. Just fill that in, that'll come to me, and I'm very happy to have a no obligation call just to have a chat about what the particular organisation that you're representing needs, whether we can help or not. And if you want to apply for accreditation, there's a button right on the front page of our website that says apply for accreditation here. You press that and you can start the process off.
And there is a fee that's attached to that, and that varies depending on the size of your organisation. So if it's a small organisation and you're intending to get big, you start with really what is going to be a small accreditation fee. And I won't ask you about that because listeners can go online and they can see what those fees are. But just for listeners who might be interested in getting your organisation accredited, we're talking today with Christian Ministry Advancement, and of course our guest is leading the Christian Ministry Advancement Standards Council, Steve Kerr. He's Executive Director of that and based in Melbourne. But you can connect with Steve at the website cmasc.net.au. That stands for Christian Ministry Advancement Standards Council, cmasc.net.au. And I guess you could simply just Google CMA. There's going to be a link there. And I know that you're going to be at this conference this next couple of days. This is the sort of thing you'll be talking to all sorts of people there at the conference about.
Oh, you bet. You bet. I'll be talking about it until my lips drop off and their ears drop off, Neil.
All right. You're intending to work hard, and you'll get home after the conference, and there'll be an inbox full of all sorts of things from our listeners who recognise the importance of what we're talking about with this accreditation. So let me give that website one more time, cmasc.net.au, and you'll be able to connect with Steve Kerr. You'll also be able to listen to this conversation on a podcast, and you might want to send it on to someone who is in authority in your organisation. That might be a very useful thing for them too. Steve, thanks so much for sharing your insights with listeners today on 2020.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.